A lot of people have reported that previously nice smells now smell like petrol or something weird, or that they may be able to smell things that they can't name. You've got about 4 million smell cells in your nose. So if you imagine that a smell is a bit like playing a chord on a piano, got a lovely C major chord, and then if you imagine now one of the keys doesn't work, or you've connected it to a completely different note, when that chord comes along, it now makes a discordant, unpleasant, perhaps a sound that you've never heard before. And so that's the kind of thing that's happening in your nose when you get damage to it, either by physical damage or by disease.
Wow, thank you so much, Matthew, for agreeing to have a chat with me today. I mean, like we were just saying, I've been a little bit phlegmy recently, so I've been thinking about my loss of smell, and I wanted to ask you if people had sort of been in contact with you about COVID and the whole like loss of smell and taste thing, if your insights were sought after.
Well, kind of, but I don't really have any, so it doesn't go very far.
Right.
I mean, there's two things. Firstly, why it happens, and the simple answer to that is we don't really know. So what your sense of smell, and it's linked with your sense of taste. So that's the interesting thing, is that some people say I couldn't smell anything. Some people say, well, I couldn't taste much. And the reality is that your sense of taste is in fact very limited. It's basically 5, 6, 7 dimensions: salt, sour, bitter, sweet, kind of meaty, and then hot, cold, kind of peppery hot, and then maybe a couple of others, and that's it. Whereas your sense of smell is basically infinite in its dimensionality, much richer. So what happens when you taste something is that you get a mixture of the taste sensations, those 5 or so dimensions, and also the information from your nose. And you can see this very, very easily. If you hold your nose and eat, say, a sweet, I don't know, jelly bean, something like that. You hold your nose and close your mouth and just chew on it. You can barely taste anything. As soon as you take your fingers off your nose or you open your mouth, woof, you know instantly what flavor it is. So it's a distinction between taste, smell, which are the basic sensory modalities, and then our perception of flavor. So what's happening is that people are thinking they've lost their sense of taste, or stuff doesn't taste much, in fact, because they've lost their sense of smell. And your sense of smell works by having these neurons dangling down through the base of your skull, and they detect odors that are high up in your nasal cavity. And we know that the virus can get into your body through inhalation and through this nasal epithelium. But it doesn't attack the sensory cells. So the actual cells that are detecting the smells don't have the right protein on them. So either what the cells next door, however, do. So there's a whole load of cells in this epithelium. They do have this ACE2 protein on them. So either they get inflamed and unwell, and that generally messes up your sense of smell, simply because your epithelium is all horrible and gunky, and so the neurons can't detect the odors properly. Right. Or perhaps these cells also do other things in our olfactory processing. They produce rather mysterious proteins that help to take the smell from the outside world and put it on the receptor. And it's possible that that function is being altered. But to be honest, we don't know. What we do know is if you lost your sense of smell and you haven't had a head injury, it's pretty likely that you've got COVID.
So is it quite a common thing then to lose your sense of smell? Because lots of, like, we get colds and flus and everything's kind of like airborne, and your nose is like, one of these first barriers to the human body, isn't it? So like, is that something that gets a bit of a punch quite a lot?
Well, Well, it's certainly, if you've got a cold, I mean, you can't smell much, partly because it's all gunked up with snot. So what's unusual about COVID is that it doesn't in general have a runny nose as one of the symptoms, and yet you get this, and many people get this very dramatic loss of smell, which maybe the only symptom they have. So one of the issues, it's kind of ironic, I think people who work on olfaction, in particular people who work with people who've lost their sense of smell, are quite not gratified, but I mean, in the past, before COVID, if you went to your GP and said, I lost my sense of smell, they basically say, well, tough, that's it, you can't do anything about it. It'll either come back or it won't. And there's one reason for that is it is very difficult to treat. But the emphasis on what's called anosmia, so losing your sense of smell in COVID, means that lots of people now taking this much more seriously. And for example, there's a charity called fifthsense.org.uk. So anybody who's lost their sense of smell for any reason, or maybe as you know, it happened years, decades ago, I'd advise them to go there because there's support, there's help, and there is the possibility, if it's a long-term problem, of doing what's called smell training. So this involves trying to recover some of your sense of smell by repeatedly smelling very strong smells. You have to do it in a kind of organized way. There's another charity called Absent, ABSCENT, which offers this kind of training. So with a bit of luck, because lots of people lost their sense of smell and just been kind of left on the wayside by the many, not all, many medics, in particular GPs who don't know any better, which is fair enough, but even kind of ear, nose and throat surgeons. But there's now a growing number who realize that, one, this is a significant problem because, you know, if you imagine you can't smell your loved one, you can't smell your child, you can't smell your pet, never mind about eating. So it's as a part of your emotional world, to lose your sense of smell can be quite upsetting and disturbing and miserable, to be honest. So it's very important that people don't, if they get brushed off, they don't accept that, and they do have a look at Fifth Sense, Absent, go and talk to their GP and try and get some help.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said it. I mean, we don't categorize it with sort of losing your vision or your hearing, but I mean, why not? It's part of your world, the way you work your world, right? I had a flatmate actually who either his sense of smell wasn't there at all, or it was really, really bad, because he used to make like he said, like, I can't really smell or taste anything, and just used to make the most garlicky meals. It would make my eyes water with the cooking, because, you know, so I kind of appreciate it then. I mean, so we don't really know a lot about ways of recovering smell then. I mean, if
well,
GPs
yeah, I mean,
and
well, they are basically right. It either comes back or it doesn't. You may be able to increase that, make that process more rapid if you're lucky. But let's say you've had a head injury. So a lot of people, you know, contact sports or just getting a bit drunk and falling over and banging your head, that can mean you lose your sense of smell, probably for good, because these neurons that actually doing the detecting, they dangle down through the base of your skull at about eye levels. It's really high up where you're doing the smelling. It's about here.
Right.
And if you have a sudden movement, then literally the bone just chops them off. They get sheared. So the cells can regrow because they're stem cells. But the challenge they then face is finding their way back to the right parts of the brain so that the wiring, if you want, is still makes sense. And that, for reasons we don't understand, they find very difficult to do. So the cells can regrow, but they can't actually do anything. What might happen as well, and this is another symptom of the current epidemic, is that only some of your cells will be altered. And if that happens, you may start smelling strange things. So a lot of people have reported that previously nice smells now smell like petrol or something weird, or that they may be able to smell things that they can't name. So this is something called phantosmia. I mean, I get this. If I get a bad cold, I can smell what I can only describe as burnt toast. And it took me, I mean, despite the fact I worked in this field, it took me years before I finally realized that there wasn't any toast burning downstairs, and it was in fact this kind of illusion produced by infection. So if you imagine that, so you've got about 4 million smell cells in your nose, and they're divided up into 400 types basically. And each of those types can detect more than one kind of smell, and each smell can activate more than one kind of receptor, one of these types of smell cell. So if you imagine that a smell is a bit like playing a chord on a piano, it's lovely, and you've got a lovely C major chord, and then if you imagine your piano, now one of the keys doesn't work, or you've connected it to a completely different note, when that chord comes along, it now makes a discordant, unpleasant, perhaps a sound that you've never heard before. And so that's the kind of thing that's happening in your nose when you get damage to it, either by physical damage or by disease. That it may be either you knock the whole system out, or that some part of your system is now no longer functioning. And so you get this distorted sense, which still seems very real, but it's not actually there. So it's like an illusion.
Right. Oh, that's so interesting. I mean, you said that some people then smell things like petrol, but there's a lot of people that really like that. So, I mean, these
It might be okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in general people find it disturbing because what you're smelling, you know, you've got your favorite perfume and it's now smelling weird.
Yeah.
So I was talking to a BBC reporter, this was on Inside Science the other week, and he noticed this because the deodorant that he liked the smell of now smelt stale and off. So he went and bought another one thinking it had gone off. I mean, deodorant doesn't go off, and that was the same. So he went and bought another one, and then he twigged that it wasn't actually the deodorant, it was him. And so, you know, this is something that people find quite often. You get this strange alteration. Now, with luck, in the current pandemic, this seems in most cases to go away and people recover. So either as the infection plays out, the cells aren't altered, or the inflammation goes, or whatever it is that is producing this distortion of our perception gradually alters.
Is it these cells then in our actual physical nasal cavity that dictate whether we like and recognize smells?
Oh, no,
or is it what's...
Well, I mean, if you imagine that they're a bit like the cells in the retina, they are simply going to process the immediate stimulus. That then goes up into the brain. I mean, technically they're part of the brain, just like your retina is. They're connected to the brain. But it goes through, the signal goes through the base of your skull into the olfactory processing areas where the smell is identified, and also then its significance, which may be learned. So it may be a smell that you've learned to associate with something you like. And in general, our perception of smells is culturally determined. Apart from acrid things like ammonia and so on, different cultures value different smells and put different labels on them. Even something you might think is disgusting, like the smell of feces, children generally have to learn to find that disgusting. It's not an innate fear and hatred of that smell. So there are some smells like the smell of vomit that have a very powerful smell. I mean, you know, if you've ever been on an airplane when somebody's sick, then very quickly everybody starts to feel a bit queasy.
Very sick, yeah.
It's fairly obvious the evolutionary reasons why you might have that. In case you've all eaten the same stuff, then you're better off getting it out. But most smells we have to learn, and it's culturally determined largely, what smells we value and what smells we don't like. So that's all done higher up in the brain after you've identified it.
Wow. So that, yeah, then is there with this COVID recovery, is there a way to train smelling? Can you kind of go through a training, a smell physiotherapy after you've lost your sense of smell to sort of like...
That's a bit what smell training is. So basically it's giving you very strong smells. So as I say, you'll smell repeatedly a series of very strong smells over a period of several weeks, you'll do it every day, you'll inhale them deeply, and it's probably doing two things. It may well, we don't properly understand the way that smell cells grow and develop, but it may well be that simply stimulating them is encouraging them to grow and encouraging regrowth if they've been damaged. Or it may be a psychological effect that you're learning to pay attention to particular stimuli that you had been ignoring. So how it works, as often in medicine, is perhaps less important than that it does work. So for some, the fact that it doesn't, we're not quite sure how it works doesn't really matter. Some people can get great relief out of this over a period of time, but it's not a guarantee. And in particular, if you've had a head injury, then it's quite, and that's how you've lost your smell. And certainly if you've never had a sense of smell, so there are some people who, for genetic reasons, don't have a sense of smell at all, and they never have done, that's not going to change. But I think with COVID in particular, and so many people reporting these symptoms of loss of smell and loss of taste, if they persist more than 2 or 3 weeks, and then it's going to start affecting, because you'll have recovered from the other symptoms, then you should clearly talk to your GP, go on one of the websites, Fifth Sense, Absent, and see, they've all got Facebook pages as well, and then see what support you need. Because it may simply be a matter of talking with other people. If it's a long-term thing, there are recipes you can share, tips for living with a sense that you've lost. So, have I left the gas on? So, the smelling gas is added. So natural gas doesn't smell of anything. So when they changed from coal gas to natural gas in the 1960s and 70s, they realized that they needed to let us know if we've left it on. So they put a very strong smelling stuff called mercaptan into the gas, so it smells very strongly, and so it's there. But clearly, if you lost your sense of smell, you don't know, and that may then drive all sorts of other, compulsive fears and behaviors. So you need to get on top of this fairly quickly, I think, is the real advice.
Yeah, definitely. Like you said, it's a whole way of understanding where we are in the world. Why don't they do that with carbon monoxide as well? Why can't they put something in?
Well, carbon monoxide is generally not produced, it's not pumped into your house, it's when it goes wrong. So you get carbon monoxide poisoning when the fire is blocked or the flue's blocked, and so it's not supposed to be there. Whereas natural gas is supposed to be there when you turn the gas on. So I think that's the reason. I think you'd have to. I'm not sure how you could cope with that, doing that.
Yeah. You said that medicine just sort of plows forward, finding stuff that works and worrying less about why. But you are very much embedded in the why, right? You want to know how this stuff works.
So,
you want to know
I'm not
how.
a physician, not a clinician. I have done some work on people, but that's not really my thing. So that's. Anybody's listening will go, wait a minute, I just paid attention to him. He doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yes.
I know enough to give comforting advice. There you go.
But no, I mean, well, you know a lot about the sense of smell, and you're obviously like very, very interested in it. Why did you choose smell to spend your career on?
I wanted to get a job, to be honest. So I am interested in how behaviour emerges from nervous systems and how it has been selected by evolution over the millennia. And the system that I was studying from my undergraduate days, so we're talking over 40 years ago now, was the tiny little fly Drosophila. And that's used by geneticists, has been throughout the 20th century. And we know more about it than we do probably any other organism apart from a rather boring worm, which has only got 1,000 cells in it. So Drosophila is the tiny little fly that you get buzzing around your beer if you're outside, or coming out of your bins in September. Very, very small, and we know an awful lot about it. So I was studying this fly, and in particular, one of the main things you can easily see it do is its sexual behavior. So the males and the male will court the female. He runs around after her, trying to convince her to mate. Again, this is something that's been intensely studied for over a century now, and we still don't fully understand how it works. And one of the things that I was working on in the early 1980s was how the male and female signal to each other chemically, the pheromones. So these are chemical signals that they produce. And we had some understanding of that, but then I needed to apply for a research job. I was working in France at the time, and so I had to have a kind of project. This is what I'm going to be doing, spending the next 10 years doing or whatever. And at the time, we knew even less about sense of smell than we did now. So we decided that I would have a research project based on the sense of smell in maggots. The maggots are the baby flies. And this is basically taking a step. The logic behind all this is trying to find a simple system that expresses an interesting behavior, but which you can then try and understand. If you can understand something in a simple system, maybe it can then be generalized up to a more complex system. And so to give you an idea, the adult fly has about 1,200 smell cells. As I said, you've got 4 million. The adult fly has about 1,200. They're divided into about 60 different types. The maggot has just 21 smell cells, and they're all different. And so it's got a very, very simple system. So you have the possibility of knowing how individual cells contribute to the maggot's ability to wriggle towards smells. And the person I was working with, Jean-Marc Jalon, who's a French researcher, he said, well, look, you should try looking at maggots. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. They're really boring. They just, they don't do anything. I'm interested in flies. They're much more interesting. And he said, no, just go ahead, just do it once, And in the end, I had to kind of give him, say, okay, I'll just do it once. This is a very simple test. You get a dish of kind of jelly, hard jelly, so they can move about on it. You put a smell on one side, something they like, something like the smell of pear drops, that kind of thing. Nothing on the other side. You put a bunch of about 30 or 40 tiny little maggots, only a couple of millimeters long, tiny little things. Put them in the middle, put the lid on the dish, and then I watched this and I waited for 5, and well, even after a minute, they were all moving towards the smell.
Unsurprisingly, right? You were like, okay.
Well, yeah, I thought, okay, right. So I'm going to do this, because one of the things you learn if you're studying sexual behavior, and this is as true in flies as in anything else, that you set up your big experiment and then nobody wants to do anything. They're not in the mood. The flies just sit there. And what I realized is that flies are very complicated. And maggots, being much more simple, were a better tool to try and understand how they respond, the neuronal basis of it, and so on. So basically, that's what I started doing in the late 1980s, mid to late 1980s. And then about 5 years after that, there was an immense breakthrough, which really changed how we study the sense of smell and how we understand it. Two researchers in America called Linda Buck and Richard Axel identified what they thought, rightly as it turned out, were the genes that produce those receptors, not the neurons, not the cells, but the receptors, the little, imagine it like a lock. So if the smell is like a key and it comes along and it turns the lock on a particular neuronal cell. And they discovered the genes in a rat. They discovered the genes that encoded those receptors. Well, they thought they did. In fact, they did. And over the next decade, we gradually discovered using these genetic tools, it then opens lots of doors. We discover that, in fact, olfactory receptors in insects, which I was studying, are completely separate to those in vertebrates. We discovered that things like spiders don't really have olfactory receptors in the same way. So what we thought would be, I think most of us imagined that all of life would use the same kind of way of detecting smells. It turns out that it's been reinvented over and over again over evolutionary time. And in the end, Buck and Axel in 2004 won the Nobel Prize for their discovery. And since that time, especially in this century, there's been a massive amount of interest from neuroscientists in how the sense of smell works. And so it's now Yeah, it's a big deal now. When we started, it was pretty small, and there are only I don't know, a couple of hundred researchers around the world who are really interested in it. Now
Right.
there's thousands and thousands.
Now the spark has been lighted. So your work then, I mean, I was going to ask you, you sort of like you wanted to understand behavior in humans and smell, but you took away as much complication as you could to find something where you can sort of ask an A and a B and get the answers from there. But is it now, are you realizing now that that sort of making any links between that to what humans do and sort of mapping the path of evolution is very not so linear?
Well, it's certainly not so linear, but one of the intriguing things is that whilst the receptors on the outside of those cells are different, the wiring diagram of your nose is basically the same, whether you're a human, a maggot, a lobster. They have basically the same structure. And there's two alternatives. Either this is what the common ancestor of you and me and a maggot looked like. That's what its brain looked like. That goes back around 600 million years. I think probably it's more likely that our common ancestor didn't have much in the way of a complicated brain, and that what we see is what's called convergent evolution. So evolution poses a problem. How are you going to process these complicated chemicals that are moving around in your environment, which might be in the water, it's not necessarily in the air. Fish have a sense of smell as well. And it seems that the answer to that is you need these particular structures, this particular kind of sequential processing, which all animals have. So there are indeed insights you can get from, because the gross structure, the wiring diagram is the same. They don't have exactly the same jiggery pokery, but the wiring diagram is basically the same. So there are insights that we can get from simple organisms and try and understand how that works in more complex ones. But the big difference is that I can do things with a maggot that I can't do with a human, I'm glad to say. So,
they won't say no either.
Well, indeed. I mean, I just
So-
hope that, I mean, I'm not a Buddhist. Did have a researcher who was a Buddhist once. He went on to become a Buddhist monk, actually. And so I think he's got a lot of bad karma coming to him, given the number of maggots that he did terrible things. So yeah, we can record we can make a maggot, because we can manipulate the genes of these flies. We can make a maggot with just one smell cell in its nose, just one. Only one that works. And it can still wriggle towards a smell. And you can then put an electrode into that cell and record the signal that's coming into the maggot's brain, and try and then understand how it assembles these various 21 different signals to form an image in its tiny little mind. And we still don't really understand how that works, but we can get at the basics in a way that, I mean, you wouldn't want me putting an electrode into the base of your skull, I guess.
Not for the purpose of smelling pear drops, probably not.
But
Okay.
to understand the basic processes, you need to use, as I say, very simple systems.
Yeah.
And this ability to manipulate maggots very, very carefully and precisely is one of the great advantages of using. The disadvantage is they are incredibly small and it's very, very fiddly. So that's the downside. But you can't have everything.
So what you're finding is with this wiring, this sort of like across all kinds of species, it's just the way that they then detect these chemicals and take them up into the brain that is different. So obviously with a fish, it's not got a nose that's got hairs and this going on.
It hasn't got hairs, it's got a nose.
How does it
Go
work?
to the fishmonger. Have a look. Of course they got a nose.
So it's got a separate nose that it uses for smelling.
It's got two nostrils or nares at the front, yeah, and the water goes in there. The difference in it doesn't need to do that because it's
Right.
moving in water, and so it goes over it. I mean, come on, you've heard all these tales about sharks being able to detect a drop of blood
To
in a
smell,
swimming pool.
yes.
I mean,
Yes.
I've no idea how they test that, and I guess they never have. But
Right.
yeah, fish have a sense of smell, and it's basically the same as yours and mine.
Yes, yeah. And how well do smells move through water compared to air?
Well, they
Because,
move differently. So if you think about it, water, air is they're going to diffuse. So if you put something in a corner of the room and just wait, it will passively, slowly diffuse, and that will depend on the molecular weight, what kind of atoms there are in the particular smell. Most smells are molecules; they're not single atoms, and they will slowly diffuse through the air. In water, that happens as well, but at a much slower rate. And above all, you've got much more movement. Well, unless you're in a pond or something. If you're in a river, then it's continual movement, or in the sea, there's continual movement all the time, probably more so than, if you're sitting in your room, less so if you're outside on a windy day.
One thing that you touched on earlier that I wanted to ask you about is pheromones. So we think of that as it's quite a provocative term for us. We think of pheromones in the way that our hormones work and how we think about other people and are sexually attracted to humans and stuff. But how important are they for humans?
There are no known human pheromones.
Really? It's not.
No.
So all of this stuff about we must have, we can, that's why we're attracted to certain people and that kind of stuff. There's no evidence for that.
Well, yeah, it might be true. There's no evidence, and it's not for want of looking. So one of the things, if you go to certain shops or to certain places on the internet, you can find a substance called androstenone, which is often sold in packs that say either attracts men fast or attracts women fast. So that tells you something about it. And that's been the main one that's been argued for very poor reasons to be a human pheromone. But the fact that you've got that variation, and the fact that it can allegedly attract both sexes, suggests it's not a sex pheromone. Above all, when you actually give it to people, you get a huge range of responses. So some people might, like me, think it smells quite sweet. Many people think it smells horrible and disgusting. I use this in my public talks. If we were in the same room, I'd give it to you now and we'd see what you smell.
Yeah, like. I don't know.
One young student, female student, I gave it to once. Excuse my French, she said, it smells like sweaty ball sack. So it
well, that kind of
probably
fits.
A bit too much information, but it's probably right. And then other people can't smell it at all. And a small proportion, maybe in my completely non-scientific experience, about 5% will go, how are you doing? And they quite like it. But they're generally a bit too embarrassed to admit that, because everybody else is either go, oh, that's all right, or oh my God, it's disgusting.
Right.
I like that. So that variation too shows that it's not a pheromone, because the point about a pheromone is that it's bang, all or nothing. What's particularly fascinating is that this odor, which is, although it's found in human sweat, it's not particularly relevant odor in our biology as far as we know. It is found in pigs, and it's a pig pheromone. So the male boar produces it, and this he produces it in his saliva. This acts as a pheromone for the female, the sow, who then start to ovulate. So basically, if you are a pig farmer, you get this stuff in cans, you spray it up the nose of the sow, you surprise her with a turkey baster, and then you end up with piglets. So that, again, it is a pheromone, but in pigs, and it has a very clear physiological mechanism. It doesn't do in humans. And what's fascinating is that it's an exception to the general rule I said earlier on. I said earlier on that each smell can activate more than one kind of receptor, and each receptor can be activated by more than one kind of smell. Now, androstenone only activates a single kind of receptor in our nose called OR7D4. And OR7D4 only responds to androstenone. And we know the genetic basis. We know what's happening. We know why some people like it and some people don't. And there are two letters in their DNA change. So the difference between me, who it's quite sweet, it's not unpleasant, and the poor girl who really didn't like it, 2 letters in our DNA, just 2 letters. Now, and this is where we get to the problem about working with humans. What that's telling us is that those 2 letters of DNA, they encode the lock that I talked about. They're part of the structure of that lock. So you imagine, it's why the lock and key analogy is not a good one, in fact, because if you put a lock into a key into a lock, it either works or it doesn't. But noses and nervous systems in general aren't digital. They're not either on or off. What happens, and my work has shown this in the maggot, is that when a smell cell is activated, it does all sorts of things. It can really get very excited. It can go completely quiet. It can show differences in the shape of its response. And so what is happening in somebody who likes it and somebody who doesn't like it is the shape of the receptor is slightly altered in ways we don't fully understand. And it's altering the way that alters the way the cell responds. So somehow somebody who likes it like me has a particular signal going to the brain because there's only that class of cell can send that information. Somebody who thinks it's disgusting has a slightly different kind of waveform. And what that shows is that's all that perception is. Perception, though it feels you've got somebody in your head looking out or sniffing or whatever, you've got a little mini me inside you. It's all just the activity of neurons. And this is ultimately down to the shape of the receptors on the outside of those neurons in the case of smell. So you can actually predict from somebody's response what their genome is, and from somebody's genome what their response will be. It's one of the rare exceptions because there's this one-to-one relationship which generally doesn't hold in the relationship between smells and kinds of olfaction. So this I was working with some colleagues and we were looking at how these different genotypes, these different forms of gene encoding this receptor are spread across the world. And we were looking at cell lines from indigenous peoples who've given their cell lines to be studied by researchers. So we've got a genome of people all over the world. And that was all very interesting. And what it showed, as we kind of expected, was that the ancestral form, the original form, the form that's strongest in Africa, which is where we're all from, is the, oh my God, it's disgusting version. Okay?
Oh.
And the it's not so bad version is more recent. And one of our hypotheses is that this may be related to the advent of pig farming. Because if you're a pig farmer, you have to castrate all your male pigs, unless you're going to use them for breeding. You do that partly because they'll fight each other, but also because you end up with what's called boar taint, because the male produces this androstenone, which at least some people think is disgusting. So if you produce pork with boar taint, then a lot of people won't want to eat it because they think it smells disgusting because of this flavor business that I talked about at the beginning. So we were doing this work and we haven't, that's just our hypothesis. It hasn't been proved at all. But one of the things that then struck me, and it's probably the only really, really good idea I've ever had, was that, okay, if we can go from the genome of somebody to how they respond, we know there's a very tight link there. What about extinct humans? What about Neanderthals? Because we've got their genome since 2010.
Yes.
We have the Neanderthal genome. So we have the same olfactory receptors. There are only 96 amino acid differences between us and Neanderthals. So they're the same species. So we can go and say, okay, what's their OR7D4 receptor like? And it had the form of people currently living in Africa. It's kind of what we expected. It's the ancestral form because the Neanderthals left Africa before we did. And also they never developed agriculture. So if it is agriculture that's encouraged the development of the it's not so bad version, that didn't happen to them. So they would have lived their lives if they ever smelt one of these piggy smells thinking, God, that's not like that.
Right, okay. It makes sense.
And
Why
so
would we like the smell of a turned on male pig? It makes total sense.
I don't know. That's
Okay.
maybe something that goes way much deeper back in our evolutionary history. This stuff may have been a pheromone or a significant odor at some point millions of years ago. So you can use, the principle is what we showed, is that you can use DNA from extinct humans to understand something about their sensory world. And my colleagues who did this work, Kara Hoover and other researchers, are now looking at other smells that they don't only activate one kind of neuron, but they only activate a small number, and trying to see how extinct people might have sensed the world that they lived in 50,000 years ago.
Yeah, and this just adds to the sort of clues that we can look for, right? This is another thing that we can sort of build into the picture of what was going on back then and how did we get then to here to now. And I love the fact that it's so physical, like you're talking about. It's literally the shape of something right in there that determines sort of your experience with things. Is there much, so you talked about sort of studying people all around the world indigenous to different areas. Are there really like vast differences, or do we tend to sort of, you talked about cultural smells, but those are all quite individual, right? So if you grew up in a certain
not really.
area.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, there are
As in like you wouldn't inherit it.
variabilities. Well, yeah. I mean, it's nature and nurture. So there are individual differences between us. So somebody who really doesn't like androstenone is unlikely to be able to convince themselves that it's nice. Right. But above all, the kind of smells we value and the things we think are interesting are culturally determined, and that is going to change over time because cultures aren't the same. So as certain smells are valued, or different practices evolve, maybe cultural, maybe religious, use of incense or whatever, then you get different smells are valued. So anthropologists, this is a growing area, they'll go and talk to indigenous peoples around the world, and they will then say what they think of various smells. And one of the things that generally happens is that smells are used to other communities to say they are different. And this is particularly true in the West with regard to immigration. So immigrants smell, their food smells, it smells horrible. During the time of the Raj in India, the British colonialists all said that the Indians smelled horrible, and the Indians all said that the British smelled horrible. So it's often used, because they're culturally determined, it's often used as a way of of saying somebody else is completely different because they smell funny, unpleasant, they have odd smelling food, I don't like it, and so on. I mean, this class is incredibly important. If you saw the film Parasite, which won the Oscar last year, if people haven't seen it, well, watch it and you'll see that smell plays a significant role. So it's used in distinguishing classes, in ethnic groups, immigrants versus those who are already there, colonial powers, and so on. And that goes back. We can see this in writings in Roman times and so on. So it's a significant part of human culture that has, up until about 20 or 30 years ago, had barely been studied by historians, but increasingly they're investigating it.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we've sort of it's a way of classing people as other. They're not like me because of this, and this, and it's quite sort of, well, I mean, if you compare it to animals who, when they smell, they really are detecting differences in each other, right? So I spoke to a woman who studies ant colonies, and she was saying that with ants, they detect ants from other colonies that smell differently. They have this different coating on the outside of them, so they can tell who's part of their nest and who's opposite. Whereas with us, it's more it's not real, right? It's we recognize the smell of Indian food, as you were saying, and it's sort of more of a psychological othering. Is that right, or is that?
Yeah. I mean, we're not ants. So ants are hardwired to basically not like anything that doesn't smell like them, unless they think it's food. So then certainly one of the things about ants is that their smell or taste, it's quite complicated, because as you said, it's on the outside. What they have is on the outside, these kind of waxes on the outside of their cuticles, the same kind of thing as I was studying my flies. In fact, we pioneered it in flies, and then we ended up applying it to ants in the people I was working with. So ultimately that work goes back to my work.
Oh, excellent.
Well, it's not because of me, it's because the people I was working with, they were the smart ones who kind of figured it out. And all this was in the 80s, and we now know that these waxes, they're present across all arthropods, including those that live in the sea, so crabs and so on. But when it comes to ants, those smells are a mixture of genetically determined and also environmentally determined. So you will have you might have a big nest of ants that then splits into two. So they're genetically very, very similar, but because they're not eating exactly the same food or living in exactly the same soil, they gradually, over several years, will end up with different smells, and then they will attack each other.
Right, I see. Okay, so it's not innate. It can be learned.
Well, it's both. I mean, the response is innate. The fact that what they do is to recognize this is not what I'm surrounded by. It's something different. And some species of ant are what are called slave making. So they will actually go to other nests and steal the pupae, steal the baby ants, and they then bring them back. And these ants then emerge they hatch out into a world. And as far as they're concerned, this is normal.
That's their world. Yeah.
Yeah. And although they're not at all related, they end up working for those ants, and the other ants don't attack them because they smell like the nest.
Right.
So in fact, the ant's nest gets free labor because they haven't had to invest in feeding these ants as larvae. So they put nothing in, and they get a load of extra workers who are now duped by their genetic programming, which says, okay, I emerge into my world and I'm now surrounded by insects that I'm closely related to, because that's the normal situation, and I will therefore work to help pass on my genes, not directly because I don't reproduce, but through the queen who is producing my nieces, sisters, or whatever. But that's not true in their case. They've been completely fooled by the whole thing, and that's all based on chemicals. So without the chemicals, without this sense of smell stroke taste, as I say, it's rather hard to work out exactly what it is, but it's chemical signaling. Without these pheromones, none of that would work. So at root, much of the planet's ecology, if not all of it, is ultimately based on smell. If you think of pollination, one of the things that insects use is to remember particular smells that the plant gives off, the flower gives off, are associated with the sugar reward. That's the nectar. And in getting that reward, they get covered in pollen, which they then go and transfer to another plant, and they're therefore fertilized. It's not just bees. Most pollinators are flies, in fact. So a key part of our ecosystem, which is how the plants are maintained, in the case of insect pollinated plants, is all based on or involves fundamentally the sense of smell.
Yeah. So is there work going on right now to sort of understand the effect of our changes, anthropogenic changes and pollution and stuff, on the smelling abilities of all of these pollinators?
Yeah, so both in particular, pollution has massive effects on humans and on animals. So pollution, for the same kind of reasons we were talking about with COVID, particulate pollution, so from diesel fumes and so on, alters our sense of smell. And again, there's kind of a class element to what you can smell. If you are living in nice, clean air, then you will have a better sense of smell than people who are living next to a very dirty, next to a motorway or
Right.
next to a factory or so on, your sense of smell will be damaged. And there is some evidence that this even may allow the transport of particles into your brain. And a lot of people looking at neurodegenerative disorders are very concerned that inhalation of microparticles through your nose will allow these particles to get into your brain and then may have unwarranted consequences. In terms of pollination, diesel fumes alter how things are perceived by plant odors, are perceived by bees, for example. We use bees because they're relatively straightforward to study. You can show clearly by training them to particular odors, you can show the role of olfaction in as a sense of smell in their response. And if you give them lots of kind of diesel fumes to smell, they're less acute. So it is affecting how insects are responding, how we're responding. Now, there is a cautionary tale here. Up until a year ago, a bit less than a year, I would have also talked about ocean acidification, because there was a large body of work which suggested that fish in increasingly acid water, and as we increase the CO2 in the atmosphere, that is going to be dissolved in the water and the oceans are going to become more acidic. That fish in more acidic water, that altered their sense of smell. And this kind of made perfect sense because it's all about chemistry ultimately, as I've indicated. So you've got a smell wafting through going through the water, perhaps the smell of home, so a fish that goes back to the reef at night, or the smell of a predator, so you can escape it. Just think of Nemo, Nemo going back to into the anemones. They do that every night. They go back and they do find a sense of smell. And so people were very concerned about this. And then earlier this year, a paper of researchers who'd been trying to find out, well, how does this work on a cellular level? How is this, what's really going on here? They did they couldn't replicate the effect. So they got a bit alarmed. So they did a very, very big study with lots and lots of different groups using much larger sample sizes and kind of computerized video recording. And their conclusion was that there was no effect. So there's kind of good news and bad news.
Oh, wow.
The good news is that for the moment, the jury's out as to whether ocean acidification will alter fish olfaction.
When it gets to a certain...
If it doesn't, that's good. If it doesn't, that's good, right? The bad news is that it does mean it's possible. As I say, it's not all been resolved yet. It does look as though this may have been an example of scientists not trying to fool themselves, but being satisfied with a small sample size that went in the direction they expected, and then kind of assuming that was the case and just carrying on. This remains to be seen, but it's a cautionary tale about a lot of behavioral work, and this is particularly true in the human sciences when you study human behavior, is that many of the studies are based on small sample sizes with measures that aren't necessarily completely objective, and if you try and replicate them, you often don't get the same effect. So this was a big surprise.
I feel surprised because surely, like, so I understand it correctly. In ocean acidification, it's an increase in carbon, right, in the water because of and so, but would that not affect the way that chemicals and molecules that are the smells are formed? And
well, yeah, that's what you'd expect. My guess is that it has to be an awful lot more acidic than anything to survive. So the relatively small changes that we're talking about, I mean, they're going to be catastrophic, but they're small on a pH scale from 0 to 10. I mean, these are really quite small shifts. That those changes, which were what were being studied and what we are expecting over the next century, they will not, it appears. I mean, as I say, this remains to be seen. But I mean, the failure to replicate was published in Nature, which is one of the leading journals, and above all, it virtually never publishes, oh, we got no effect. It doesn't like that kind of study. But this was so important, given that it's been used, I mean, understandably, it's been used as an argument in policy, and an awful lot of researchers were interested in this, that they felt it necessary to publish this failure to replicate.
Yeah,
So, as I say, it was based on hundreds and hundreds of fish. There were 3 groups around the world. And above all, their intention was good at the beginning. They didn't say, aha, we're going to get him. You know, it was, this isn't working. Why isn't it working? We're going to do it again and again, and then get other people involved. And and that's all you can do as a scientist. When the data tell you something, you may repeat it because you think, well, this is odd. Yeah, but if the data come back the same again, and if your large sample size again reinforces that confidence, then whether it's a positive result or a negative result, in the end you have to go with it and say, well, for the moment it looks like it's this way. So that's an exception. At the moment, the data on the effects of air pollution on humans and on animals are good, and but this fish stuff, I mean, I think it's important that people know that science is not an ever proceeding upwards slope. We make mistakes, things get wrong. What's different about science to other forms of knowledge is that it's got this self-correcting element, and that anything that is profoundly mistaken and is of significance, because clearly there are minor reports and that don't really matter and nobody cares. I don't know, if my maggots responded to one smell or another, it has no, if I got it wrong, well, I got it wrong, and it has had no consequence for anything.
Be a small circle.
But if it's important, then it will be corrected by further work eventually. Yeah.
So it's not so much that it won't ever happen and that it has no effect at all. It's just at the moment we are safe, and that's kind of what people are interested in.
Well, for the foreseeable future, as far as we understand it, fish aren't going to be affected, it appears, in the way we thought. But I mean,
but it's up for.
Much of the work was done by one particular Australian researcher, and he kind of pioneered it. And he, of course, was unimpressed by this big article, and he has promised to come back fighting with more data, because he's convinced he's right, which is fine. And maybe he is, but we'll see.
I really liked what you said then about, it's not, science is not a linear sort of passage, and particularly because, this is only sort of, smell research is only really a part of what you do, right? You have this whole other persona that you're a historian of science as well. You're interested in how do we know things, how did we get to knowing these things, why did we investigate and go down certain routes to figure stuff out. I mean, looking through your sort of roster of work is really cool. And you just brought out 2 books at the same time.
It wasn't the best time.
This year. Why? One was a smell book, and
one is called A Smell, a Very Short Introduction. It's one of those Oxford University Press very short introductions. There are hundreds of them on all sorts of different topics, and if you want to know basic information about any topic virtually that's to do with science, it's mainly science, but not only, my advice is to go and have a look at one of them. It's better than Wikipedia, and they're nice little books. They're about £8-9. So I brought that out on sense of smell, and then I published a very big book called The Idea of the Brain. Most scientists don't really think about the metaphors they're using. They just use them. People have said the brain works by hydraulics, or the brain's like a telephone exchange, or it's like a computer, which is the current model we work with. And they shape, but eventually come to limit what we can imagine, what we can think about how the brain works. And therefore, if in the past we've used technology and it's shaped our understanding, what's going to happen in the future? At the moment, there's this tidal wave of data coming from imaging studies of the brain, from studies of the electrical activity of the brain, and that information is very difficult to integrate. And so people are saying, look, we don't have a theory. It's not good enough to say the brain is like a computer. We need something more complex.
Right.